You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of June, 2024 on Monocle Radio.
France prepares to vote, Europe holds its breath. Do candidates' debates do anybody any good, aside from programmes on other channels at the same time, and Monocle's annual revelation of the world's most livable cities? Put the champagne on ice, Krasny asked. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Alex von Tunzelmann and Terry Stiastny will discuss the day's big stories, and our weekly letter is a letter from Annecy. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Alex von Tunzelmann, the historian, author and screenwriter, and Terry Stiastny, the author and political journalist. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Alex, as we were discussing in the waiting room shortly before we went to air, your recent doings and indeed upcoming project are shrouded in mystery.
Yes. I'm doing a documentary series about historical true crime for Radio 4, but I'm not allowed to say what it is yet. So very appropriately.
It is very appropriately.
The mystery is unsolved.
And if listeners knew what the mystery was, they would appreciate even more greatly how appropriate that is.
Wait and see.
When are you able to tell people?
I don't know when they decide that I can. I mean, they're pretty laid back.
So this is one of those things where your job is so secret, even you don't know what you're doing.
No. I haven't a clue.
Amazing. Terry, you have been, because you have been professionally obliged to pay attention to the ongoing and mercifully, why should I say mercifully? I've been thoroughly enjoying this general election campaign because I am somebody who is perpetually interested in the degree to which human beings can screw things up.
Yeah, it's just, sort of small catastrophe piling on small catastrophe in the British election campaign. Sort of every advert that you see, every latest scandal, whether it's, who's betting on the result, who's betting against themselves, who is betting on the date of the election, or none of these things we thought were likely to happen or you'd expect to be the things that are going to affect the election, and they are, and it's all very strange.
Well, see, I was braced for disappointment when Rishi Sunak first announced the election, standing in pouring rain, struggling to be heard over the strains of somebody playing Labour's 1997 campaign anthem at him, and then formally launched the campaign in a quarter of Belfast named after the Titanic. I just thought, okay, he has peaked way early. This is as much fun as it's going to get. I should try and enjoy this. But it has just kept on giving.
Oh, and yet this afternoon, I think the latest one was the Conservatives put out an advert with Angela Rayner, the Deputy Labour leader, in which they sort of play the Marseillaise and then put a strange beret and a moustache on her to suggest that she's going to bring in French labour laws. And you kind of think, who exactly is this appealing to? Because half the people coming out, wanting some crisps, and the other half are thinking that, they're just humming the Marseillaise, and nobody really understands what's going on there.
Which is a undeniably belting tune, and I'm glad you mentioned France, because that's where we're starting. And on Sunday, French voters go to the polls in the first round of the snap legislative election called, to the surprise of many, by President Emmanuel Macron after his party list was roundly tubbed in EU elections. If polls are any guide, Macron may have ushered the far right into government and his centrist allies into a distant third behind the far left. Though Macron is entitled to remain president until 2027, he could find himself governing alongside a 28-year-old Prime Minister from Marine Le Pen's National Rally. But was that maybe the idea? Alex, you may be familiar with the theory that President Macron sees this as a win-win. Either, most straightforwardly, he gets a better result than he anticipated and his vote holds up all right, and the National Rally, the far right, do not get into government, or the far right do get into government, make a complete pig's breakfast of everything in the way that populists usually do when they're allowed to govern, and Macron is therefore able to usher his successor into the LSE palace 3 years hence.
Yeah, I mean, I think the second is optimistic because, I think there's always this sort of sense that somehow the far right will be defeated in the marketplace of ideas, because they are, I mean, to be fair, often not terribly competent in government at achieving the kind of things they set out to do. But of course, what they're very competent at a lot of the time is continuing their messaging and also really, getting themselves into power and staying there. They're actually very good at that, and you can look at places like Hungary to see where that's happened. You can look at all sorts of places where that's happened, and indeed you could look at the United States, although you might want to do so through your fingers from behind the sofa, as to what might happen if Donald Trump gets back in. I think it's very dangerous to assume that this is some kind of fair playing field, and that therefore these, rather incoherent, poorly costed, bad ideas that are coming up will fail, or that if they fail, the outcome will be that the electorate will see the light, change their minds and go, actually, we need the sensible centrists back. I'm not sure that's actually a consistent pattern you can look at historically.
Terry, what do you think? Is President Macron perhaps overestimating the reasonableness of his fellow citizens?
Yes, I think so. And I think it's so risky what he's done, particularly because this idea that, they'll come into power, they'll fail, they've only run a couple of small town halls in the south, they haven't done that particularly well, might be one thing. But what they will be likely to say is that we haven't done what we promised to do because the president stopped us. And you can see that they are already picking that fight. I mean, today, Marine Le Pen has been saying, well, notionally the president's got control of foreign and defence policy, but actually it's the prime minister who has the purse strings, and we're not going to let him do stuff that we don't want him to do, like sending troops elsewhere. And you can see that if they run up into constitutional problems, like if they want to change who is allowed to be a French citizen, for instance, which they have been talking about, they're going to say, this is not our fault. We promised to do these things, but the president, the constitution, everybody else has stopped us. So you've got to vote for us properly to be in power.
The other optimistic view of this tactic, Alex, is that Macron has perhaps been, inspired might not be the right word, but he has looked at what has occurred in Italy, where, of course, the far right did get elected. Giorgia Meloni from the Brothers of Italy, a party with direct roots, quite recent direct roots to neo-fascism, is now the prime minister. But having arrived in power, she has not been quite as cranky as was feared. In fact, she's actually been quite sensible on quite a few things, Ukraine not least among them.
Yes, which has indeed been a surprise to many people. And I suppose that is probably acting as a wonderful piece of confirmation bias towards these hopes that somehow the far right will not be as bad as planned. Of course, I'm afraid Hindenburg sort of floats through my head at this point, thinking, let's test this out and let's see what happens.
The eternal rebuke to the idea that, if we put these people in power, they'll have to become more reasonable.
Yes, quite. I mean, this really doesn't always happen.
No.
And I think in France, actually what Terry said is absolutely crucial there, because a central piece of how the far right operates is to find enemies and saboteurs that they can blame for not being able to do the magic things they want to do. And I mean, you certainly saw that pattern in Britain this is where the entirety of Brexit came from, was that the EU had to be used as a scapegoat, and then, the dog caught the car and didn't quite know what to do with that. But in France, absolutely, because Macron is there in power and is going to be there for another 3 years, effectively, anything that goes wrong, the far right will be able to say is because of him. This is exactly right. They will be able to blame these saboteurs. And in America, you've seen it with Trump talking about things like the deep state, this kind of made-up idea that the government is full of saboteurs who are stopping him from carrying out his great mission to make America great again. So it becomes part of the rhetoric. The fact that these people are being, in some way kept in check becomes part of their argument for why they can't be what they want and why they need even more votes. So it's actually part of ensuring a much longer grip on power.
Terry, there was the first time Trump was elected, and it's happening again in advance of the possibility that he might be re-elected. A lot of nervousness and anxiety among the United States allies as to what this should portend, but should there be a broadly equivalent amount of anxiety about the prospect of a national rally-led government in France in a couple of weeks, and possibly a Marine Le Pen presidency from 2027 onwards? Because France, as we have discussed many times on this programme, after Brexit, is in a unique position. It is the only country which is a member of NATO and the EU and the permanent five of the Security Council. It is a big deal.
It is a big deal, and it is a big deal precisely because of the membership of those institutions and the view that the far right has of those institutions. I mean, Jordan Bardella has been talking about wanting to get a €2 billion budget rebate from the EU. Marine Le Pen's been questioning, France's role within NATO. You can imagine that there becomes a sort of a block, if you like, within the EU of, we're going to come on to talk about the Dutch government of Orban, of others who are basically starting to say, OK, we don't like how this works anymore. We are not necessarily going to be part of a European project. And they are going to start to potentially rethink attitudes towards Ukraine, in particular, attitudes to what NATO's for. And I think that could be a real divide, particularly within the EU, where you've got a lot of countries that are saying, hang on, no, we really need to stand up to Russia because our existence is at stake here.
Alex, just a final thought on this, because it's a thing that it strikes me that both, sappy centrists and soppy liberals have never really quite got to grips with. And it will come up if Marine Le Pen runs for president, her long history of enthusiasm for President Vladimir Putin of Russia. And the default, I think, among centrists and liberals about things like that is to think, well, people are voting for her in spite of things like this. But what if they're voting for her because?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, there certainly has been not only a considerable Russian propaganda effort online to kind of radicalise certain groups and so forth, but of course you also do have some people who straightforwardly do sympathise. And certainly a big overlap, I would have thought, with Marine Le Pen's base, with those sorts of people. I mean, I sort of wonder that if you are a big Marine Le Pen fan, whether you're going to be put off by the idea of her supporting Vladimir Putin. What? Who thought that would happen? I mean, this can't be a big surprise to you. Surely that's factored in. And I think, there is also the case that one must remember that, unlike those of us sitting here in Monocle who care deeply about foreign policy, international relations and these sorts of things, the vast majority of voters generally do not.
Indeed.
I think there's a very, very small number of voters who care about it. And what they largely care about is things like, why are we spending money on this foreign war when I can't get a hip replacement or the bus isn't running? So there is a very localised element to politics. I'd say usually you get about 20% of people who actually care about foreign policy is a realistic bet, between 10 to 20 people. And beyond that, people have actually very little interest. So I think there is great power, unfortunately, in the argument that why are we funding this war in Ukraine when we need to, be spending the money closer to home. So actually, I'm not at all convinced, again, that her support in the past and possibly the future for Putin will be particularly deal-breaking.
Well, on an adjacent topic, and indeed in a broadly adjacent country, next week the new cabinet of Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof, get over it, will be formally sworn in a little over 7 months since the Netherlands' most recent general election. A hold-up of this variety is not altogether unusual in the political history of the Netherlands, but the reasons for it this time are. Last November's poll was topped by the Party for Freedom, an unsavoury sack of populist tub-thumpers who have previously been generally piously shunned by other parties. Schoof, a more or less unaffiliated compromise PM, will have Party for Freedom ministers in his cabinet. And Terry, there's a lot going on here which does tie into our previous topic. There has been around the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, as there is mostly around a party like the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, what is thought of as a cordon sanitaire. The idea is that however many of our fellow citizens may vote for these people, we, the respectable, sensible parties, will not do business with them. But we have reached a point, as Dick Schoof has, basically said out loud in the Netherlands, that so many Dutch people voted for them that that's not really a practical option. So do we glean from this that the cordon sanitaire doesn't actually work?
Well, I think we glean from this that it's obviously taken months and months to try and negotiate the formation of this new government, and you've got 4 different parties all trying to come together within it. And part of that, I think, is an idea. We're talking about these sort of maybe the illusions that people have, and I think this is the one where you think, oh well, if we bind them into a government with lots of other parties, then it will probably be fine, and we can probably keep them under control, and we will have a sort of technocratic form of civil servant who's fairly benign, and people will think, we can control this. But I suppose the question is, that's how people are quite used to Dutch governments working. You've had Mark Rutte there for a long time, and he's sort of Mr. Stability, and, he's handing things over as he goes off to run NATO. But the question is, how long will this coalition hold together? Because you've got some quite disparate people trying to come together, and whether Wilders and his party will end up walking away and saying we don't like this, or whether they will want to try and take control of more jobs.
I do want to come back to that question of how serious the PVV and parties of this sort are about actually governing. But there's another illustration, I guess, Alex, of the inbuilt difficulty of trying to bring such parties into government. At least one PVV minister, Gidi Marketsauer, has been withdrawn. This was after Geert Wilders, the leader of his own party, was shown what Dutch intelligence services had come up with when they'd done a bit of digging.
Very unfortunate indeed. And yes, it's kind of interesting because, also the Dutch cabinet ministers, prospective cabinet ministers, I suppose at the moment, have to kind of go through some questioning and so forth in a sort of, there's questions put to them. A lot of those, of course, have been about the sort of past statements of various PVV members. And of course, Geert Wilders has also been absolutely provoking more and more controversy on social media with some pretty horrendous comments about Islam. He's refusing to withdraw that. But actually, I was quite interested in Dick Schoof's response to this, in that he said, when these kind of questions were coming up, what about all these people? They said these crazy things. He said, it's important for us to be judged immediately on our words and actions during the cabinet period. So he is trying to say, look, whatever went before, yes, there was some crazy stuff went down, okay? But now, let's see how this goes going forward. Let's focus on what people do and say now. And let's see if that holds. That's quite a tricky... I can't see what else he can say, really, given the situation. This is surely the attitude one has to take to try to make this work. But I would be surprised if you could completely stop some of these creepers from coming up during the time.
Because, Terry, this is an eternal question about politicians of a certain stripe. And it's an observation that was frequently made about Nigel Farage, the current leader of Reform UK here in the UK. During the long years that he was an MEP in Brussels, he famously did more or less nothing. And I think it's fair to say that if the people of Clacton do elect him their MP next Thursday, it will be the last they see of him. But Alex did refer to these recent remarks about Islam by Geert Wilders. They are not the first such he has made. They will not be the last. But whether he's doing this deliberately or just sort of instinctively, does this strike you as the behaviour of somebody who actually wants to make a cohesive collegiate cabinet work? He's basically asking to be thrown out, isn't he?
Yeah, that could well be the case. He's already gone through the election. So, often that's the kind of thing you get in the campaign, is people making these statements that they know are sort of a dog whistle statement for the people who will hear what they want to hear within them. But yes, if he's not able to get through a lot, policies that he has proposed in the past, and some of his more extreme stuff he did have to kind of tone down a bit before the election, but not by much. Yes, maybe it will be that he ends up walking away from this, and then the government has to reform in some way. But it was interesting what Alex was saying as well about comments that people had made in the past, because Dick Schoof himself used to basically run the Dutch security services, so you would think he would have a fairly good inside track to being able to know or to find out what people have said in the past. He would know who to call if he needed to.
Well, we will doubtless be returning to that story next week, but let's return to the election happening here. And last night, the two chief contenders for the job of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom squared off in their last debate of this election campaign. And tonight, the two main candidates for the job of President of the United States will meet in the first debate of that campaign. The Starmer-Sunak contests have inevitably been affected by polling, which has encouraged the incumbent to flail wildly in the hope of landing something, and the challenger to hunker in the corner awaiting the bell. The build-up to the first Biden-Trump debate has been dominated by cheerleaders for Trump, suggesting that Biden is old, unhinged and incoherent. A bold gambit, all things considered. Alex, are you a debate watcher?
So I did watch the debate last night. And it was so awful. I'm afraid I did have to turn it off, actually, when they sort of got to the questions about immigration. It was just so unedifying. I think it's a format that is very, very recent in the UK. It actually only started with David Cameron bringing it up as a presidential debate, a style debate in 2010. And of course, in the UK, we don't have a president. So this system doesn't actually make an awful lot of sense within the British political system to have these head-to-head leadership debates. It's really not how politics works unless you happen to live in the constituency of one of the MPs standing to be Prime Minister. If their party is, well, it's starting to be appointed by the King as Prime Minister if their party gets the most seats. So, you know, there's a certain kind of nonsensical nature to it. And I think what became clear last night is also that this format isn't a kind of meaningful debate in any way where people really would be putting different points of view and considering them and responding. It becomes a kind of match of who can shout the more sound bites more quickly and louder, interrupt the other. And it's more of a sort of gladiatorial sort of contest. I actually rather wished they'd just given them nets and tridents at a certain point and let them duke it out.
Well, that would probably be a ratings winner, Terry, which last night was not a fun fact. 3 million people watched the debate last night, which is not bad going. 6 million watched Georgia versus Portugal.
Much better time.
Which actually wasn't a bad game. But Terry, you must have been professionally obliged to watch several of the debates we have had over the last few weeks, and there have been quite a lot in different formats. Was there any one or other format that appealed to you in particular? So I quite liked the Sky, like loath though I usually am to endorse anything that involves the general public. I did quite enjoy the one on Sky in which not only were they allowed ask questions, but they were allowed follow it up as well.
Yeah, I think the more that the candidates are forced to actually engage with the audience beyond the, you know, well, Andrew, I'm so sorry to hear about your terrible experience of the NHS, or whatever it is that you know has to be sort of programmed into them because you can pretty much recite it before they say it, you know, and if they don't do it, you're like, what are your advisors telling you to do? So it's looking at the expressions on the questioners when they just realised they didn't get an answer to what they were doing. I think the very first debate where the answers were some ridiculous length, like 45 seconds long, just didn't work at all because they'd barely begun to say anything. But I think maybe we came to it too late as a country. You know, we came to this in 2010. The Americans have been doing it since sort of the 50s and the 60s, and you know the great age of sort of Nixon and Kennedy and all of that, and they had and everyone watched. And now we're into the age of internet and streaming and people watching loads of other things at the same time. And you know, even the French have been doing this since the 70s, and they had a few zingers against each other, and they tend to sort of do very snide little insults against their opponent, and they try to get it past, and rather than shouting in a little sort of, you know, look at me being a clever intellectual way, which is quite fun. But I don't think we haven't really got the hang of it in this country.
I mean, do the formats need to be tweaked or rethought for the modern age, Alex? I keep thinking, and it was an idea posted online by Marie Leconte occasionally of this programme, suggesting that maybe the way forward is just to put both of them on the same sofa with the cameras trained on them, no moderator, no prompts, and just let them talk to each other for an hour.
Actually, that doesn't sound entirely stupid.
No, actually, even thought of as a joke, I think that's actually not a terrible idea.
No,
I think you would learn a lot.
You might learn more, especially if you didn't tell them they were being broadcast.
Another reality format. Do sort of come dine with me or something, where they have to cook each other dinner and then they have to discuss whether it's any good or not.
The thing is, like, I can see the light bulbs going off in overheads all across Channel 4 and ITV right there.
Gamify it more. But no, I would say, I think, and we should also look back and, you know, I mean, quite rightly, Terry sort of refers to this, you know, golden age of debates with Kennedy. But I mean, remember, Kennedy and Nixon was an absolute disaster in that because Nixon refused to wear makeup, Kennedy, of course, was quite happy to do so. He looked incredibly sweaty on camera and actually lost loads of standing in the polls. It was a complete disaster. But not for reasons of any substance.
It is a truism, I believe. I don't know if this is the case or not. It is certainly a thought often circulated that people, this is going back to 1960, of course, Nixon versus Kennedy, that people heard it on the radio, thought Nixon won.
Yes, exactly.
People saw it on television, thought Kennedy did.
That's right, and that's because he was all sweaty and basically, you know, I mean, for trivial reasons, really, which is what would happen to anyone, actually, under studio lighting who had decided not to wear makeup. So, hot tip, wear it. Don't worry about that. Don't forget your masculinity. But,
I mean, also, you could specifically say to Nixon as well, don't be a sort of oily, oleaginous, shifty little creep.
Well, there's that, but apparently people quite liked that when I heard that on the radio. So that didn't seem to matter. But no, what I mean is that actually even if you look back at that age when you might assume that there was actually a bit more to it, the substance wasn't the point. That was basically a beauty contest. And so I kind of wonder really whether in fact this entire thing is just a piece of nonsense, and that really you ought to be kind of moving on to rather more sensible ways to talk about politics. Because I did find last night watching it, there was no light shed on anything at all. Quite the opposite.
There was not.
The style was unpleasant, very combative, and there was no substance. So, I mean, this is why I end up turning it off, is just feeling like I'm learning nothing here, apart from that I dislike this format.
Terry, it seems wrong on all sorts of levels to refer to what the American people will be subjected to later today as a beauty contest. But this is a challenge for Joe Biden, who obviously cannot run any risk of being seen to take a physical or linguistic misstep, and is going up against somebody operating from a completely parallel reality with an entirely separate definition of victory. If you are Joe Biden's people, if you were right now one of Joe Biden's people, what pre-match counsel would you be giving him?
In a way, I think you have to do slightly what Rishi Sunak did last night and just try and go, I'm just going to keep talking. Because if he hesitates, if he looks unsure, if he looks around from side to side and doesn't look like he knows where he is or something, that will be the clip that people seize on. And Trump's probably going to try and talk over him constantly. So he probably just has to go at it as hard as he can and hope that, no slip-ups happen.
I mean, does he try acknowledging the age thing? I mean, obviously there is a small gap between them, and it's probably too small for him to do any rerun of Reagan's famous put down of Walter Mondale, I think it was, when I think Mondale made the mistake, or the moderator raised Reagan's age, and Reagan said he would not make his opponent's youth and inexperience an issue. But does Biden score any points by going out and saying, yeah, look, I'm 81. I'm not as fast on my feet as I once was. Maybe I don't talk as quickly as I once did, but I haven't been convicted of 34 felonies.
Well, I mean, that's one way to approach it. I did hear somebody say, and I thought it was rather a good tip, that Biden could probably win the whole thing if when Trump is really going off on one, he just turns to camera and raises an eyebrow. That, perhaps there are ways like that to do it. But I think it's quite...
Or if mid-Trump rant, he just said, actually, you know what? Keep going, mate.
Yeah, no, don't let me stop you.
Look at this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite... Well, it's difficult to predict anything around Trump, who, of course, is highly volatile, and we've got absolutely no idea what he'll come out with. And I think that's the other difficult thing about any debate format, is that if, as you've made the point, one candidate is not tethered to reality, then again, this is not actually a level playing field. These people are not operating and they're not playing the same game. So that's very difficult, because the person who's trying to stick to a message, to a kind of sensible point, to stuff that they can say that's kind of politically considered and isn't going to sort of promise things they can't do or go outside certain boundaries, is really doing something a lot more difficult than the person who's just shouting crazy things as if, in an alley outside a pub. I mean, this is quite a different situation.
Well, we will move along now to some ill-disguised cross-promotion. The annual July-August double issue of Monocle magazine is on a newsstand near you and contains, among much else, Monocle's annual quality of life survey, naming the 20 most pleasant cities on earth in which you could be living. London does not make that list, which is topped, and not for the first time, by Munich, ahead of last year's winner Vienna and recurrent podium stander Zurich. Does anybody, Terry, I'll ask you first, want to make a case for London? Has the city from which we are broadcasting been hard done by?
I've had a lovely week in London, and I live in a nice neighbourhood where sort of pretty much at the end of each street around me, I can go and buy fresh bread, really nice cakes, really good restaurant. I can go to a lovely open-air 50-metre swimming pool that's about a 10-minute bike ride away, and it's probably less expensive than any of those other cities you mentioned.
It's usually my custom to complain about how far down the list Sydney and Melbourne are, Alex, both of which are delightful and both of which are in the top 20. This year, I do find it quite hard to argue with Munich. I'd never really been there before the last couple of Munich security conferences, and we did have a big sort of cocktail evening for the foreign desk ahead of the most recent Munich security conference. I spoke to a lot of people, a lot of Monocle listeners from Munich, and I said to all of them variations on, when they asked him, what do you think of Munich? I just said, this just seems like it would be a really nice place to live. And they all sort of nodded solemnly and went, yes, it is.
I mean, I think the thing is, different people do want different things from their cities, I think it's fair to say. And the way I would speak up for London, I think it's absolutely right to say London has lots of issues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's pretty filthy, a lot of it. It's kind of, you know, some of the transport is pretty badly designed. Some of the new stuff's pretty good, but it's quite variable. The transport is terribly expensive. There are lots and lots of issues with it. But the thing is, I personally like it because I quite like places that aren't very conformist and are a bit edgy and have a few rough edges on them. Personally, I prefer that to a very neat lawn and very sort of scrubbed streets. I don't mind a little bit of grot and grime with my glamour. Therefore, London for me works very well. But I absolutely appreciate and understand that not everybody is up for that.
I just wanted to ask you each in turn, finally. You first, Terry. When was the last time you went to a city for business or pleasure and for whatever reason thought, actually, I could live here. This is nice. This seems like it would be all right. This is what I kept thinking about Munich. It's just like, why are we not all living in Munich?
Yeah, most of the places I get and think this is a lovely city. This is really nice. I mean, I was in Riga, is the place I went to most recently. I think
Riga's lovely.
Yeah, it is lovely. But I kind of thought, what would I do here? I suppose I thought I could sit in a lovely apartment and write books. I guess that would be, which I could pretty much do in any nice city in Europe.
I mean, sitting in a nice apartment in Riga writing books, there are a lot worse ways to live than that.
I think so. Munich also has a really, really good stationery shop. It's got like 4 stories, and it's one of the best stationery shops I've ever been to. So
I've missed the stationery shop.
That would get me.
Next year. Alex, do you have a if I didn't live here, I would live there kind of city?
So I do, because a couple of times last year to talk about one of my great interests, statues, I ended up in Vienna. And you
say you have an interest in statues, Alex. Have you by any chance recently written a book on the subject?
I have, Andrew. It's a book called Fallen Idols, 12 Statues That Made History.
But return to your reverie.
Very, very kindly was invited twice by Viennese to go and speak in Vienna. And I found myself liking it tremendously. And I think part of the reason, and this was something that as a Londoner I really appreciated, was actually the availability of decent housing, was that actually that allows for a population who are spending far lower percentage of their income on accommodation to live really much better lives and be able to eat out and, enjoy the public spaces, enjoy exhibitions and galleries and shop for nice things and all of this, and really have very pleasant lives because they're not sort of spending, as many Londoners are, more than 50% of their income on accommodation.
There was my family who grew up there would tell you, you do get told off for not doing things correctly quite a lot in Vienna. That used to be the way. If you haven't put your rubbish correctly, people will tell you exactly what you've done wrong. So.
Yes, there's that in Switzerland too, isn't there? Yeah.
Indeed so. Alex von Tunselman and Terry Stiasny, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it's time for our weekly Letter From feature, and today Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid takes us to Annecy, a city in the southeast of France, where every year thousands of fully grown men and women, I'm betting it's a lot more men than women, gather to spend an entire week watching cartoons. No, really.
Do you ever have the urge to relive your carefree childhood days by watching dozens of animated films back to back over the course of a slow summer week? No? How about a trip to a picture-perfect postcard town that blends the food and atmospheres of Italy, Switzerland and France into a single deliciously pretty package? These might sound like oddly specific urges at opposite ends of a spectrum, but for the few of you whose tastes land just on that animation/Italo-Swisso-Franco intersection, I've got just the place for you. In the southeast of France, just a short half-hour drive from Geneva, Switzerland, and not far from the border of Italy, you'll find the beautiful alpine town of Annecy. Replete with a warm sapphire lake, rustic architecture, and snow-capped mountain views to accompany your daily sampling of French wines, Italian pastas, and Swiss raclette sandwiches, it also happens to be the site of the world's biggest event for the animation industry, the Annecy International Animation Film Festival. I headed down to report on this year's event, which has been going for over 60 years and is now attended by some 16,000 animation professionals, students, and enthusiasts from over 100 countries. Alongside the bigwigs, from Disney and Netflix to special guests like Wes Anderson,
what's the subtext here?
The event also hosts hundreds of independent artists from across the world as they screen their films, pitch new projects to producers, and network their way through the week-long animated festivities. This year's edition highlighted just how global the art of animation has become, with artists from nearly every continent coming in with high-caliber productions to rival the Hollywood-dominated, child-oriented cartoons of the past. Just to give you a taste, the films I saw this year included a Hungarian animated documentary about a post-Soviet Union train ticket fraud.
Nekem saját anyám azt tanított, hogy más embertől lopni bűncselekmény, az államtól dicsőség.
Pakistan's first ever hand-drawn animated feature about the horrors of war.
Isko फेंक दे! Isko ज़ाया कर दे! रुको!
And an Australian stop-motion film about a suicidal snail hoarder.
Snails never go back over their trails. Set yourself free.
Still, I couldn't help but find the Savoyard city of Annecy itself to be the most memorable character of my trip. Often nicknamed the Venice of the Alps, Annecy can't really compete with the 150 canals of its Italian nickname's sake. But the 3 canals it does have shimmer with a character all their own and speak to what makes the city such an attractive destination and the perfect place for a film festival, its walkability. From the moment I stepped out of the train station, I was repeatedly delighted to find that almost no point of interest took more than a leisurely 10-minute stroll to reach. This is not to say that Annecy is samey and boring. Its pocket-sized districts all have a distinct quality that makes the city feel bigger than it is. From the more modern feel around the station to the rustic canal-sliced old city, or from the 12th century chateau on the hill to the aforementioned Sapphire Lake with its panoramic views and quick access by bike into nature. Spending a day in Annecy feels a little like picking through a delightful confectionery box, where each new bite is both complimentary and refreshing. It also doesn't hurt that the city is spotlessly clean. Even the leftovers of the busy morning markets get swept away by cleanup crews in short order, and public bins are plentiful and aesthetically integrated. You'd be forgiven for fearing that this little slice of French paradise would be desecrated once descended upon by an army of animation fans and turned into a nightmare of costume degenerates a la Comic-Con. But thankfully, people in the animation industry turn out to be quite well-mannered and dress more or less like normal people. In fact, the festival goers were so well behaved that to my surprise, the French locals didn't seem completely infuriated that we were there. Still, after the cartoon banners came down and the festival's animated guests had left, I imagined the petite city of Annecy breathed a sigh of relief at the return of peace and quiet.
Thank you, Gunnar. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Alex von Tuntelman and Terry Stiasny. The show was produced by Henry Rees Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.